National security threats this century can look quite different than last. So when the Prime Minister recently called out China for, quote, aggressive games targeting Canadian elections, it sent a collective shiver down the spine of those concerned that Canada isn't quite on top of this complicated new reality. With us now for their assessments, we welcome, in Chelsea, Quebec, Vincent Rigby, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, currently a visiting professor at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. And in the nation's capital, we have two senior fellows from CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation. There's Bessma Momani, who's also a professor of political science at University of Waterloo, and Wesley Wark here, who served 2 terms on Canada's Advisory Council on National Security. And we're delighted to welcome Bessma and Wesley back to our program, and Vincent Rigby, you for the first time. So great to have you all aboard. I want to start by just reading 4 short précis of recent stories about Canada's place in the global intelligence landscape, and then I'll get you three to comment. Number 1, last month, Norwegian military security services arrested an alleged military intelligence agent from Russia who lived for many years as an alleged Brazilian national in Canada. Number 2, Canadian authorities have been alerted to the existence of 3 Chinese so-called police stations in the Greater Toronto Area in predominantly Chinese communities. Number 3, last week, Global News broke a story about the Chinese consulate in Toronto funneling funds to at least 11 federal candidates during the 2019 federal election. And the last one, a few days ago, the RCMP arrested a Hydro-Quebec employee accused of sending trade secrets to China. Some recent stories plucked from the headlines. Vincent, start us off. All of this has happened in the last month. What do these stories tell us about the challenges that Canada's intelligence services are facing?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that we are basically looking at a world that is extremely, extremely turbulent. So the headlines that you've just discussed or mentioned reflect that reality, and in particular, a world where we've seen a resurgence of great power rivalry, and we have a hostile state actor like China, and it is very hostile both in its region and in other countries, flexing its muscles a little bit. And so you've seen a lot of this over the last number of years, but I think it's really been starting to pick up momentum since President Xi came to power, and I think it's becoming really a serious problem for Canada. But I would turn the question a little bit on its head just to say that I don't think it's strictly about what does it say about our intelligence agencies. I think it speaks a lot to what does it say about our perception of national security writ large, of which intelligence is an extremely important component. And I think we don't take national security particularly seriously in this country. We never have, not just this government, but previous governments and populations writ large. We tend to be very reactive. We tend to be very responsive. We're there when the chips are down, but it sometimes takes us a little bit of a while to get our act together. We've not had a national security policy in nearly 20 years, no foreign policy. So we are running a serious risk again of being on our heels and not getting ahead of the power curve with these threats that are out there, because it is a very, very dangerous world. It's not just about hostile state actors. There's all kinds of other bad stuff happening as well. So we need to up our game. We need to up it very, very soon from an intelligence perspective, but from a defense, foreign policy, development, right across the board. Okay, lots to dive into there. I think I'm going to come back to the issue of how seriously or not we take foreign policy and security issues in this country a little later on, because Wesley, we need a little more background first. Do you have a sense of how many, I don't know, call them what you want, foreign operatives or spies we have operating in this country right now?
No idea, Steve. I'm sure there's many from many countries, and this is the espionage game is of long standing. What's different about it is partly the aggressiveness of some of the key actors involved, state actors, including China and Russia, but also the tools that intelligence agencies can use when they mount their operations to steal either government secrets or secrets from the private sector. And that's certainly something that's interesting about the recent Hydro-Quebec case that you mentioned. And those tools really have taken spies into the digital world, and the phenomenon of cyber espionage, its capabilities, its ubiquity, is one of the great challenges, I think, that Canada and many of its allies face. So, we could play a game of trying to count the number of spies, but it'd be very difficult to count their capabilities online, which is really, really where it matters.
Okay, Bessma, how about this? I gather Justin Trudeau and Xi Jinping had a 10-minute conversation at the G20 meeting in Bali, and apparently Mr. Trudeau said things like, Well, he was, quote, seriously concerned and was pointing out to Mr. Xi about China's so-called aggressive interventions. And I wonder, in your judgment, what kind of impact can that conversation, in your view, have?
I guess, to be frank, not very much. It needs to be said. And certainly, I think, I'm going to echo what both my colleagues have noted. The threat landscape is getting worse, and China is a key actor in this challenge that we face globally, partly because I think also China's changed. We can't ignore this. This is not the same China of 5 years ago. President Xi's consolidation of power, repressiveness is really amplified now at a time that, again, even Chinese Canadians barely recognize in many ways their home country. And this is really quite sad and impacting more than anybody the Chinese Canadian community. In addition to, I think, what my colleagues noted about the international threat landscape, absolutely. China, Russia, and even some regional powers trying to really flex their muscles, thinking of Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, you name it, all are playing a more active role in their regions and in abroad. And part of that is because of the seductive tools that are out there. And Wesley talked about technology tools. And this is really something I think we're going to have to really recognize. So while we're really thinking about spies in terms of individuals, it's not just the individuals that's really the problem in many ways. It's the seductive tools of surveillance, seductive tools of disinformation. These are cheap, easy to deploy. And lastly, because of the domestic environment where, we have enormous amount of polarization in this country, in many democracies, the rise of populist nationalists, which have been, really effectively dividing us. Many of these international threat actors now have an entryway. They have a way to penetrate our societies, to divide us from within. And that's what they're doing. It's a far easier and cheaper tool than trying to cultivate a spy to sort of, pretend to be Canadian or pretend to be Brazilian in this case, of the Norwegian case, and then studying here in Canada. That's going to become rarer and rarer. What we're going to see is more digital surveillance, more AI tools, more all of those emerging technologies being weaponized. And frankly, unfortunately, that polarization from within is just going to make it a lot easier to penetrate.
All right. Having said that, Vincent, let's assume we don't know how many spies they've got actually over here doing their thing. Can we also assume that we've got spies over there on behalf of us as well?
Well, this gets into an interesting discussion because, of course, we don't have a foreign intelligence agency. We have CSIS, with very focused on domestic intelligence. It can do foreign intelligence collection, but only on Canadian soil, and that's under Section 16 of the CSIS Act. Certainly, we have CSE, the Communications Security Establishment, which is our intelligence agency that basically does signals intelligence, listening into other people's conversations and that sort of thing. So certainly CSE is top of game. It is best in class, one of the best intelligence agencies around when it comes to signals intelligence. So absolutely, we've got our ear to the ground. We are listening. We are looking at activities overseas, and of course you need to do this because in order to protect Canadians, you need to address these threats at their source. You need to address them overseas. And I've always said that national security there's two sides to the coin. There's a domestic side and an international side. So definitely, we're doing what we need to do. We're doing foreign intelligence. Are we doing as much as we could be? That's another discussion. And certainly, there's been an ongoing discussion over a number of years whether we need a foreign intelligence agency, separate agency altogether, and can we be conducting more intelligence through embassies and that sort of thing? That's a discussion I think that needs to be had, quite frankly. We're probably ready to have that discussion, but we need to have a public discourse. And so we're not really having that in Canada because we don't talk about these threats. We don't talk about things like intelligence very much. And this comes back to the point I made at the beginning. We don't have a strong national security intelligence culture in this country.
Well, let's follow up on that. And to do so, I want to do a quote here from a recent report published at the University of Ottawa that you, Vincent, were co-author of. We're going to pull a snippet out of that and then come back with some more questions here. Here we go. Canadians and their governments rarely take national security seriously. Canada's position on national security seems little changed since 1924, when Senator Raoul Dandurand told an international gathering that Canadians, quote, live in a fireproof house far from inflammable materials. Our history and geography created and then reinforced this attitude. Collectively, we have neglected national security for decades, largely because we could afford to do so. Shielded from major threats, we generally suffered little or no cost for our complacency. Whenever we dealt with national security issues, it was largely in a reactive way, in response to events, and not through a more proactive, structured approach. Okay, we got Vincent on the record there, and then earlier in our discussion about how seriously he thinks we take national security. Wesley, let's get you on the record. Why do you agree that we don't seem to take foreign threats too seriously in this country?
Well, I think our attention is very sporadic, episodic, if you like, and it is definitely reactive. And just reflecting on something that Vincent said a minute ago, I think one of the big challenges moving forward is to really shift the focus of our national security attention. This is partly the effort, the report that Vincent was involved in, as well as a major project that we launched at the Centre for International Governance Innovation on reimagining Canadian national security strategy. And I think part of the idea here is to come to a realization that our kind of historic understanding of national security just doesn't fit the circumstances at the moment. That historic understanding was really focused on domestic national security threats and dangers that might develop within the borders of Canada. And I think what we have to understand nowadays is that while there remain clearly some national security threats, and there's been a lot of attention to those in the context of the Emergency Act Commission hearings that are underway in Ottawa, but increasingly, I think Canada has to invest far more in essentially understanding the world and understanding the nature of global threats. And that requires us to kind of reshape our approach to national security and understand it as a kind of global imperative. I think, to be honest, the Ukraine war has begun to move us in that direction in terms of both, paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine, its regional and global implications, and also the nature of Canadian contributions, including intelligence contributions to that conflict, maybe begun to change, the focus. But we have to take a more kind of we have to be able to have a more global picture of the nature of threats that might impact on us, on our allies, and our sense of what international security is. And I would just finish, Steve, by saying that it was of interest to me that when the Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, recently gave a speech in Toronto with kind of a sneak preview of the coming Indo-Pacific strategy, one of the things that she mentioned is that she wants to see global affairs invest far more in the kind of expertise it needs on China. But that's only one strand, I think, of a more global effort to understand global threats and to take us away from this preoccupation which has dominated our national security approach for forever, really, which is purely focused on national security domestic issues.
Okay, Besma, before I get you to comment on this as well, let me set up the question by playing a clip of General Andrew Leslie, who not only had a military career but was a parliamentarian for a while as well. He was on this program a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Canada's interests in protecting its northern sovereignty, and he had this to say about that. Sheldon's off today, sick. Lorraine Barton's in directing. Lorraine, if you would, roll the clip.
I would submit to you that the current government, certainly, the one I can speak about most because I was a member of it for a time, are essentially pacifist in nature. They don't believe in defense spending. And I think sort of subconsciously and perhaps not so subconsciously, they're willing to fight to the last American.
Willing to fight to the last American. Besma, is he right that we have this kind of pacifist, almost Boy Scout streak in our history that does not enable us to understand that we actually have enemies and interests out there we need to be attentive to?
Yes, absolutely. It is part of the complacency that Vincent talked about as well. It really is this sense that somehow, who would want to hurt Canada, right? You hear this. This is often, echoed. And it's certainly because I think we do have a strong country brand. That's not to ignore that in many ways we are very much favored internationally on some forums. But, in many ways, sadly, in addition to, yes, we will, be happy to fight to the last American, we're also only conscious of our national security when it embarrasses us. So what we don't want is to have someone sneak through our border and go to the United States and harm the Americans. And so we often also really worry far more about not being embarrassed by these, events of national security being trampled through the border. And so I think there is this, misallocation of interest and investment. Certainly, I think national security needs to be invested more, but I think we also need to be conscious that we want to be more defensive in our national security. It's not about getting more offensive. In that sense, I don't want us to get more spies. I don't want us to invest in having a CIA-like system. What I want us to do is to invest in being resilient, in ensuring that we have more investment in digital literacy, for example, because disinformation, all these, technological tools that are going to be used against us are going to be increasingly, as I said, attractive to rogue actors and foreign actors to use against us. So how do we raise consciousness and understanding about how disinformation is being used to polarize us by, again, foreign actors? This is the way I think of the future. I really appreciate Minister Jolie's attempt to suggest that we need to invest in more in-house capacity in foreign affairs. That's another, I think, defensive way of investing in our national security. We lack that in-house expertise. We need more GAC. We need more Global Affairs Canada. We need more investment in international development. We need more investment, I think, and again, those tools that ensure that we're resilient, that we have a good understanding of the world and Canada's place in it. And, there are a few outliers out there where there is investment, but overall, I'm afraid to say we don't put money towards that. That is not what Canada is well known for. We don't have our, equivalent of the Peace Corps. We don't have our equivalent of all of these tools that other countries have invested in to ensure that we have that defensive capability in terms of talent, expertise, that I think so many of my colleagues on this panel have reiterated as well.
Well, let's see if we have our first point of departure here. Besma says we don't need a CIA-type agency for Canada, proactively, sort of on offense out there in the world. Vincent, a moment ago, you said we need to at least have the conversation in this country about whether we need it, but you didn't actually tell us whether you thought we needed it. Do we need it?
Well, a couple of points. And can I make a comment about Andy's comment?
Sure.
From your show a couple of weeks ago, because I watched that show and I thought it was first class, and it was about the Arctic, of course. And I know Andy well. We used to be colleagues at the Department of National Defense when I worked there. I think pacifist is a little bit strong, and if I have a chance to talk to Andy, I'll tell him that a little over the top. And I think it transcends governments. To pick on this government right now and to say, you're not doing enough, I think it goes back through the decades, liberal, conservative governments, and whatever happens in the future where there's a conservative coming up, I think we need to pick up our game as a country writ large. And as my colleague said, it should be a whole of Canada effort at the end of the day. But we have invested in our defense. We had a defense review in 2017. We're having a defense update right now. We put more money into the budget. Is it enough? That's the question. And I'm not sure it is enough, but it also shouldn't be just about defense. So my issue is we should be looking at defense. We should be looking at development. We should be looking at foreign policy. We should be looking at some of our tools in CSIS, in CSC. So again, going to my colleague's comment, we need to look at all of our tools, all of our assets right across the board. And the UK did what's called an integrated review last year, where they looked at all these tools and put together a really holistic strategy to counter national security threats. And I've been stating quite publicly that I think Canada should do something differently. So it's not just about one isolated element, whether it's intelligence or defense. With respect to a foreign intelligence agency, I'm not sure that I would pull the trigger right now. I think we've got enough problems in our intelligence community, our security and intelligence community, enough issues to address that to start off by saying, look, let's blow the whole thing up and create a foreign intelligence agency. Go big or go home. I'm not sure that we need to do that. There are other things that we can do. We can look at the CSIS legislation right now. We can nip and tuck in some other places. We can do more than nip and tuck in even other places. But I would say that as part of a review of our national security, because I think it's time, as I said, it's been almost 20 years, we should put on the table publicly, do we need a foreign intelligence agency? And there are pros and there are cons to it. Wesley's written about this and knows much more about it than I do. But I think we need to dig into it and we need to explore it as a possibility. So right now, probably not, but have a discussion and let's start to think about it because as I think we've all said, so many of these issues are outside of our shores in terms of their source. And so we need more foreign intelligence than ever. We need more capability. We need to have ears and eyes on the ground externally to our own borders, finding out what our adversaries, and it's not just China, lots of other state powers and non-state actors as well that are out there doing some pretty bad stuff. So let's have the debate.
Wesley, we've got 2 no's for an immediate creation of a Canadian-style CIA. Where are you on this?
So this is a very long-running debate, Steve. The first proposal for a Canadian version of a CIA dates back to 1945. We've been talking about it forever. My position on this is that, certainly we need to pick our time to do this, but I think the arguments in favor of having a capacity to gather foreign intelligence that is not simply limited to signals intelligence. The argument for that, I think, is overwhelming. The political will has never been there, and it's difficult to know the circumstances in which that political will would actually come to pass. But I would like to say, Steve, something just in response to Besma's arguments, which I take wholeheartedly, that the idea of creating that kind of resilient Canada in the face of a very changed national security threat environment is important. But I think I would caution about understanding the creation of that resilient environment in terms of thinking about defense or offense. You can't have a resilient environment in Canada in terms of protecting all aspects of Canadian national security unless you have a capacity to know the nature of the threats that are coming at you. And I think, for example, this is what is so fascinating about the fact that the very first charges ever laid on in terms of economic espionage, have just been laid against this individual alleged to have committed economic espionage while working at Hydro-Quebec in a very kind of sensitive research facility. So you can't, in this world of national security threats, you can't just think about playing defense, and it's probably not helpful even to think in those terms. You have to know the nature of the threats, and many of those threats are going to come at you in unexpected ways, sometimes expected ways from foreign actors, and not even necessarily state actors. So that necessity, I think, I'd come back to the necessity of having a much better capacity in Canada and a much greater attention to the whole sphere of global threats is, I think, so important.
Besma, I want to ask you about multiculturalism and whether or not we are exploiting the fact that we are arguably the number 1 or number 2 multicultural country in the whole world, where people here speak, 200 different languages, whether we're exploiting that for the purposes we're discussing here today. Could we be doing more with that?
Yes, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention, one of the things that I've done and just finished is serving on the National Security Transparency Advisory Group to give advice to the Deputy Minister of Public Safety. And one of the things that we heard a great deal was from racialized communities and multicultural groups about how much damage has been done in terms of the distrust between so many of the national security agencies and these communities. And this is something that can't be ignored because, again, we need to ensure that we have that social resiliency of our multicultural communities in order to ensure that we are strong here at home, first and foremost. So we have to invest in that. We have no clear parameters to be able to provide what information can CSIS collect about communities and individuals. There's no, clear recourse that if you're targeted and mistargeted, where do you go to issue a complaint? These are really important issues. And, again, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, for example, in the case of the United States, there was this app that was developed by the National Security Agency there that effectively spied on Muslim Americans. And it was a disastrous, outreach or, if you will, activity that really caused so much damage within the community. And that's the kinds of things that we need to prevent. So what I would hate to see is for those racialized communities to be securitized, either seen as a tool in the case of, being used as potential spies and being targeted, I think, disproportionately in some way to sort of extract information from. So we don't have clear parameters about this. And the national security agencies, in my humble view, have been for too long able to, and because of the lack of attention to regulation on this, to collect information without us understanding what they're collecting and what they're doing with that data. I mean, in the age of, again, artificial intelligence and metadata and the emergence of all these powerful seductive tools before us, what are they doing with that information? Where are they storing it? Who are they sharing it with? And lastly, I'm going to point out an uncomfortable reality that I think many people don't know, but we get a lot of our intelligence from the United States. And that really is very, very disturbing. The fact that we too often, to circumvent our own laws about collecting data on Canadians, what we're often doing is just basically asking the Americans to tell us what they know. And that really is very, very disturbing. So there's a lot of gaps. And I think racialized communities, think of our Indigenous communities, our Black communities, so many of our racialized communities have been disproportionately impacted by this. And if we don't fix that, we're just not strong here at home. We don't have the proper foundation to be able to then turn around and say, hey, all of our great, multicultural communities work with us to protect Canada. That's not going to work if we don't fix the challenge that we have here at home.
Vincent, maybe I can get you to pick up on that, in as much as multicultural communities can be a resource in terms of the issues we've been discussing here as well. But I wonder, are you concerned as well that they could be vulnerable to influences from outside our borders as well?
Well, absolutely. And I was going to pick up on your use of the word exploit, because you said, do we exploit our ethnocultural communities? And I would suggest that if anybody exploits their ethnic cultural communities, it's hostile state actors who come into Canada and try to influence. I'm speaking particularly about China, but it's not just China. It's the Russians, to a certain extent, the Iranians as well. Try to exploit these communities and influence their behavior, and basically use them as tools of their own national interest. So absolutely, it is a concern. And we've seen, you had a couple of the headlines that you said at the outset of the show. All the business over foreign interference right now with respect to China. This possibility, and we don't know for sure, that there may be 11 federal candidates in the 2019 election who were influenced by a Chinese proxy of the Communist Party. So this is out there. It's a growing problem. It's a really serious problem. But just to pick up on a couple of Bessema's points, I think it's really important with ethnocultural communities that we pursue greater transparency on part of the security and intelligence community. So in order to get their support and in order to understand their needs and their requirements, we need to be more open about what we do. And I'm not suggesting that suddenly the security and intelligence community, CSIS, CSE, open up the kimono and show everything under the sun, what we're doing. You can't do that even in a democracy. It's not possible. But I am suggesting that we can reach out to these communities. We can have more exchanges. We can talk about their needs, our needs, et cetera. And I think that has been happening over the last few years. And I would strongly encourage that it continue. And CSIS and CSE have both been quite groundbreaking in some of their activities. I think the other thing is you have to look at the workforce of some of these organizations. And for a long, long time, whether it's CSIS or CSE, it was very white dominated, what you'd expect in a Canada of 50, 60 years ago. You need, I think, security intelligence agencies in the 21st century to reflect the population of the Canada. You need more diverse Canadians in these organizations so they understand these communities and that they're not victims of unconscious bias and things like that. And again, I think CSIS and CSE have been doing some great work in that regard, but I would encourage it to continue because I think it's critically important if we're going to engage with these communities and not have them exploited and to be able to work hand in glove with them. Because again, it has to be whole of Canada. It's not just about the government and the Federal Security Intelligence Agency. It's Wes said this at the beginning. It's the private sector. It's individual Canadians. It's universities. It's everybody because they're all under threat. The threats have changed. They're much more individualized than they used to be in the past.
Wesley, I want to get you to comment on something that you wrote recently about the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee's look into Global Affairs Canada. The committee looked into it. It wrote a report. You read the report. You wrote, the key issue that emerges in the report concerns a lack of detailed engagement by the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Tell me the significance of that finding.
I think it's very important, both in terms of what we expect from a minister in the kind of Westminster-style government we have, that a minister is accountable for the activities of his or her department, whether it's the Minister of Foreign Affairs or any other minister. It is clear that Global Affairs and the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, I think, did a terrific report on this, and really a sort of groundbreaking report. The Department of Global Affairs runs all kinds of intelligence programs, whether they're involved in collection or analysis or reporting or consuming intelligence to conduct foreign policy and understand foreign policy risks. if you don't have a minister who fully understands what his or her own department is doing, isn't engaged in those kinds of activities, isn't kind of overseeing them as a minister must, then I think you face real accountability and governance issues, which is, I think, the key message that comes from this report from the Committee of Parliamentarians. And if we ask ourselves the question of, why does this state of affairs exist? I think it reflects on things that Vincent has commented on, which is it goes to the deeper question of a national security culture. Ministers come into office often knowing little about national security, often perhaps not being all that willing to dive into the national security or intelligence activities of their departments, feeling that this isn't a top priority for them. And so I think what this report reflected is that kind of deeper problem with how we govern and understand and think about national security issues in Canada. And I hope coming out of that report will be a deeper sense that not only internally within global affairs is there a need to better govern their activities and make sure that they're all complying the right kinds of authorities and that they're coherent and coordinated, but also the minister starts to pay real attention to it. Because if you're going to, for example, expand global affairs' capacity to be able to understand developments in China, well, a big part of that is going to be the intelligence apparatus you have. So you really need the minister's kind of hand on the wheel on this. Just add, Steve, coming back to a couple of comments that Besma made. Again, I think have to be clear to our viewers that our national security intelligence agencies in a democracy have very clear legal guardrails. And we've heard a lot about some of those legal guardrails and the inhibitions that they've imposed on agencies like the RCMP and CSIS, for example, with regard to the Freedom Convoy. We should be glad that those legal guardrails are in place. Whether the right legal guardrails or not is another question. And I would say, just in terms of being worried about our reliance on American intelligence, again, my point of view would be very different on this, that Canada benefits enormously from its participation in what's called the Five Eyes Intelligence Partnership. And I'm not aware of any evidence that we go to the United States and ask American intelligence counterparts to spy on Canadians. This may be a fear, but I don't think there's any evidence for it. And I'm not sure why the Americans would comply with such a request.
Less than a couple of minutes to go here. And Besma, I want to get you on the issue of the revolving door that has been the Minister of Foreign Affairs in this country. We have had a lot of them over the last several years. What do you think that says?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a crisis within foreign affairs. I think there are a lot of particular reasons in the case of both Ministers Champagne and Freeland in terms of why they moved to other departments. And partly it's, I think, just that, foreign affairs is an important post for very ambitious ministers to serve in. But I think that the fact that, for example, Champagne, who I thought was really a fantastic foreign minister, went to ISED, which is a very important department, is just really the emphasis on our economic growth through technology and scientific development, which I think is very much spot on. I think we need to focus far more on emerging technologies, and I think that really intimately tied to all things foreign affairs, because as I said before, that global race, the tools for emerging technologies is going to be, I think, something that will occupy so much of our thought processes and our analysis of the challenges that we face. But I do think it's discomforting, going back to some folks talked about the Freeland, maybe not the Freeland doctrine, but certainly Madame Jolie's presentation to the Monk School. And then we had, of course, Freeland's presentation at Brookings. There were a lot of contradictions in those. And that was really something that stood out to us who study international affairs in trying to really understand what is Canada's perspective, what is Canada's role in the world. And, the fact that we, in less than 2-3 weeks, heard very diverging views is a bit problematic. And this really speaks to the challenge that we not only not have a proper national security framework nationally, but we also are still waiting very much on this Indo-Pacific strategy. It has taken much too long to get. We're waiting for a Middle East strategy as well. I mean, there are so many, I think, missing pieces to really getting to the answer of Canada's place in the world. And this is why, again, I go back to this issue. We need more investment in our in-house capacity. We need more experts. I would rather see far more diplomats than spies. I'd rather see more development specialists than spies. I'd rather see far more investment in, I think, again, lifting and upskilling our domestic capacity than I would in trying to create, again, this sort of CIA equivalent.
To be continued, as they say. Bessma Momani, Wesley Wark, Vincent Rigby, great of all of you to join us here on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.